It's great to see you folks this evening. Thanks for joining us for this webinar with James. This evening, I'll ask that you keep your mic off for the duration of the presentation, and feel free to write down any questions that you have in the chat or save them for the end of the presentation, and we'll welcome you to unmute and ask any questions that you have. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are virtually gathering here in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We are all treaty people, and our relationship is based on peace and friendship. I'm Jenica Hunsinger. I'm the Land Trust and Outreach Manager with the Medway Community Forest Cooperative and the Nova Scotia Working Woodlands Trust. The Community Forest is a member-based, volunteer-led co-op, which is piloting alternatives to traditional Crown land management. And MCFC has been incubating the Nova Scotia Working Woodlands Trust, which aims to support Nova Scotians by providing them an opportunity to secure the forests that they steward, by accessing carbon offset markets, and by upholding community easements. The mission of NSWWT is to uphold and promote the long-term stewardship of private forested lands for the rich diversity of values that they provide through ecological forestry as well as conservation. We're happy to have James here tonight to share all about climate change, carbon, and forests, as his work and research aligns so well with what our organizations aim to do, to grow and restore healthy, diverse, resilient, carbon-rich Wabanaki Acadian forests. James Steenberg is the Senior Research and Planning Forester with the Nova Scotia Department of Natural Resources and Renewables, where he's responsible for the department's research on silviculture, climate change, and forest carbon. He has a PhD in environmental science and is an adjunct professor at Dalhousie University's School for Resource and Environmental Studies, where he teaches and completed a postdoctoral fellowship looking at urban forests and climate change. So with that introduction, I will pass it off to James to take it away.
Thanks so much, Jenica. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Okay, I see some thumbs up. Thanks for that. Pleasure to be here, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about some of the ongoing work and research and thinking that we have around forest carbon in Nova Scotia. I've got a talk here tonight that's kind of an amalgamation of a couple talks I've given recently. So I think I see a lot of names I recognize, but I don't know if a lot of these folks were at the recent talks. I hope there's no repeats for people. I gave most of this presentation at the Forest Professionals AGM back in the spring, and there's a little bit of peppering from the Woodlands conference that we had just recently in the spring as well. Post-COVID, everyone's so happy to get together again. I think there's been like half a dozen forest-related conferences and meetings and AGMs. So I'm glad for that, but I'm also glad that the remote tech still gives us the chance to do things like we have here tonight. So let me share my screen. I hope I come across as coherent, because not only is it close to my bedtime having a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, but I'm also in a non-air conditioned space right now. Okay, let's see. What I'll do is maybe I'll turn off my camera while I go full screen on this. Jenica, what do you think?
Yeah, that sounds good. Right now we can see the full PowerPoint. Sorry, with the slide deck on the side here.
Okay, I'm going to go into presentation mode here. Is that full screen mode now?
Yep, that looks good for me.
Okay, you're muted, but it looks like you said yes, so I'm going to go with my lip reading skills. So yeah, thanks for that introduction, Jenica. I'm going to talk about climate change, carbon, and forests, and kind of frame it in the context of, I think, what probably a lot of people on the line will be familiar with, which is ecological forestry and the Triad, which is some of the major outcomes of the recent independent review of forest practices, or the Leahy report, as it's known. So what I'm going to do to start with is just talk about our current carbon situation, and really just talk about how do we understand the carbon stocks in the forest in this province, and where are they compared to some other things, and how do we go about measuring them? And the carbon file, if I can call it that, is relatively new in Nova Scotia. We sort of started looking at this much more seriously, although there's been past research, but really sort of started in 2018. And so we've been linking forest carbon into a lot of our planning tools and our models and our data, such as our inventory data. There's ongoing research right now, and I hope soon to be releasing some new tools available for folks like yourselves and woodland owners and forest stakeholders and others who might have an interest in actually crunching some of the carbon numbers themselves. But for now, I'll go through some of the things that we do have. So a couple of key forest carbon terms for the presentation and just kind of in general. A lot of the forest carbon accounting and modeling and research that we do at Department of Natural Resources and Renewables draws from our national inventory of greenhouse gases, which very much is built on a tool, a science-based tool based on a number of synthesized peer-reviewed studies. It's called the Carbon Budget Model of the Canadian Forest Sector. I'll probably just call it CBM throughout this report. And with CBM and with these accounting procedures that, you know, Canada does, but a lot of other nations do, and we report to the UN to hopefully meet our commitments to the Paris Agreement for mitigating climate change and reducing emissions, they put carbon into a number of different pools. And for the sake of this presentation and a lot of aggregations of different pools that we do in the modeling for reporting, we can kind of take a lot of these little smaller ones and lump them into 4 categories that behave quite differently. So the first one is the carbon that's stored in living trees, or the living biomass of the trees. So we'll call that the biomass or living biomass. And you know, that's really kind of the easiest to model and to quantify, because it draws so much on things that folks have been doing in the world of forests for decades around measuring trees that are alive. So diameter at breast height and species, those kinds of things kind of get you to where you need to be for the living forest carbon, and some assumptions around how much of that stuff is underground in the tree roots. The dead organic matter, actually, all the rest of the 3 pools are dead, but when I say dead organic matter, I'm referring to you know, coarse and fine woody material, litter, and dead tree roots and snags. So all the dead stuff that's in the forest and isn't soil, we track because they have somewhat similar dynamics that are driven by their rates of decomposition. And the soil is kind of the big beast, and we'll talk about why that is in a couple of future slides. But the soil is a large carbon pool that moves slowly but moves in a big way, and we track that separately. And then in the managed forest or the working forest, there's carbon within harvested wood products. And the time it spends in those products, you know, varies from 0 years to decades or centuries at different rates of decomposition or release of those carbons that we can track as well. And just to the other side of that, to my right, I don't know, is that your right as well? It's hard to picture what you're seeing. Hopefully that's correct, is the different zones of the triad. So I think people on this call will be familiar here, but just a quick breakdown. A core recommendation of the Leahy report was to, you know, prioritize biodiversity in forest management and implement ecological forestry, which there's a lot of things to pack into that one sentence. But one of the main tools in its recommendations in doing so was to divide the forest into all the forests of Nova Scotia, not just the working forest, into 3 functional zones. There's a zone of conservation, where the primary focus is biodiversity and only that. And those would be a lot of our protected areas and so forth. There's the zone of high production on the other range of sort of intensity of management, which would be focused on fiber production primarily. So these are plantations of softwood species. A lot of them have come from our nurseries, where there's been breeding programs for years for tree improvement. And then the big one, which is the one that was implemented first after Leahy in terms of comparing it to the Triad. There's already been protected areas, of course. And this is the surrounding much larger zone where these 2 other ones are kind of embedded within. And this is the ecological matrix. And it's the namesake of our silvicultural guide for the ecological matrix, and it's making up a good portion of the working forest now, where the primary focus there is mixed uses of biodiversity, forestry, recreation, and all kinds of other ecosystem services or values, and a real emphasis on uneven age forest management or silviculture. So let's look at what we got in our chops here in the province as it stands today, based on the data that we do have. So there's that carbon that's alive, like I mentioned, and we can draw our numbers from a few different sources. This is using CBM to crunch the numbers from our photo interpreted forest inventory across the province. And you can see some variability. This will largely be similar to the amount of, forests growing on the landscape. This is just the carbon, and you can see, fairly obvious patterns. There's the hardwood slopes of Inverness County, and sort of in the west, where probably a fair amount of you are, and MCFC is. We've got some of our bigger pine and hemlock forests. Let's not talk about hemlock. I know we'll get angry or upset about that, but you see higher growing stocks there. And the amount of carbon that's actually stored across the province is 212 megatons, in megatons, that's a million tons. So 1 megaton, million ton, so forth. CO2 weighs a little bit more. It's got those oxygen atoms hanging on to the carbon, and that's 779 megatons of carbon. But, it doesn't really mean much. It's useful to have a comparison. So here's the most useful comparison, I'm sure, to everyone here. 0.000018 megatons per person is the average Canadian emissions rate. We might be a little higher in Nova Scotia because of our energy sources, but as you know, that's in transition. But probably a useful comparison out of all these numbers would be the total emissions from Canada from the last national inventory of greenhouse gases. And like I said, that gets sent to the UN for our responsibilities there. 672 megatons. So that's the total emissions from the entire economy of Canada, is around a little bit less than what's stored in the living forest of Nova Scotia. So that's quite a bit. And we can look at that in a stratified or more sort of spatially refined way in Nova Scotia. If we want to get kind of competitive across counties here, you can see where folks are clocking in. Inverness being the winner, and Guysborough with, some more exposed open coastline and some younger forests being at the bottom end of the pack. And I should say that this is carbon storage tons per hectare of forested land only, which is an important distinction there. So if you're in, geez, I'm embarrassed. You're in Queens, right? Well, Queens and Annapolis, I think. So, doing pretty good.
Yep,
You're up
you
there
got
in
it.
at least the middle of the pack, if not higher, down your way. So that's great. But if we want to maybe look at a more ecologically meaningful delineation of this province, we can look at our ecoregions and some things that you might expect, where much lower carbon storage in the northern plateau of the Cape Breton Highlands, or the exposed coastal forests of the Atlantic coasts, and really high carbon storage in tolerant hardwood forests of the Cobequids and other Nova Scotia uplands, or along the Fundy Shore and in red spruce and tolerant hardwood country. But what about the carbon that's dead? So remember, this is the dead organic matter, excluding the soil and excluding carbon that's stored in products for a given year. And you can get an idea of the ranges there. So the orange one on top, that's the one that I just described there, the dead organic matter, excluding soils, around half, a bit more than that of the living forest. And of course, the soils clocking in at a very, very coarse preliminary estimate here of 2.042 gigatons. And I say coarse estimate because this relies on a number of assumptions of the carbon budget model, which has assumptions around a whole number of things in terms of leading species of forest stands, forest age, which is a trivial variable, and historical management and disturbance regimes. But I think it's safe to say that we're in the ballpark. This is a good tool that's used by a number of levels of government and accepted by the UN in these protocols. And we can get a sense of where these kind of numbers are, at least in relation to each other. And then in terms of carbon that comes off of the working forest in products, at the department, we track that using a few different sources of data. One would be, and this is the carbon that's stuff, as I call it. One would be our registry of buyers, which is any forest processing facility or buyer of forest products is, registered with the forest with the province, and they report the amount of products by type. This is from the most recent annual report. You can find those annual reports on the website, by the way, and we can get an idea of kind of the different mix of products and by species group, so hardwood and softwood, coming off the land base. And when we take some core modeling numbers and factors into where these might be for carbon, including what's the rate that they decompose or how long do they store carbon, according to the IPCC, or an international group that does a lot of things, as well as publishes standards for carbon accounting. And also other core assumptions too, like if we look at, for example, from this report, when we're tracking our carbon and our emissions and our carbon removals, or our how much is Nova Scotia a carbon sink or a source, we need to also know that, for example, studwoods and saw logs as primary forest products don't all become lumber, right? There's a certain amount that will become after sawmilling, but other parts of that, probably the majority, will be other kinds of products after going through the sawmill. So the economics of this are not my expertise, but certainly we need to have at least a fairly good grasp of this to do defensible carbon accounting. So these are the kind of different pools that we track, and we try and also, do a little research around areas that are, of concern by the public, or something that's growing in relevance, and something that's both of those things would be forest bioenergy systems in this province, and way to tackle some of these novel emerging areas of the forest sector or the managed forests is with life cycle assessment. So we've done some collaborative research recently with the Canadian Forest Service and Dalhousie and some life cycle consultants to try and at least start to chip away at this problem. And it's last time I gave this talk, I really had to fight to go down the wormhole of the details of this study, but I'll give my email at the end of this talk, and more than happy to share it with anyone, along with other peer-reviewed studies we've published recently around forest carbon. But the broad takeaways are many, and it probably everyone's favorite answer is, is forest bioenergy systems of various kinds good for fighting climate change? And of course, the answer is it depends. This particular study, we looked at a couple of different sources of bioenergy feedstocks. So whether that was harvested roundwood, top right picture there, or it was residual material or residues from mills. And we looked at their alternative fate. So one of the biggest things about life cycle assessment, and it can really make you pull your hair out, or I don't know what, but is you really need to consider, and in your analysis compare to what would be the alternative fate of any wood used for any kind of energy generation. This particular study looked at combined heat and power. And if anyone is looking at this map and thinking hard about it, this was all publicly available most recent data at the time that we started this analysis was used. So this is the 2017 combined heat and power capacity of Nova Scotia, which is what you're seeing here. So there's some in this map that aren't running now, and there's some that are running now that aren't in this map. But we looked at the total capacity, and that's total capacity, not the actual numbers produced in some ways of these areas in the life cycle assessment. And their alternative fate could really be of harvested wood would be, well, it either wouldn't have been cut if it wasn't used for bioenergy, or it would have been used in another product as two different fates, such as pulp and paper. And the long and short of it is, it's a fairly safe bet and defensible finding in the literature that using mill residues leads to fairly decent outcomes for climate change mitigation. So what we see in this table is the time it takes from a life cycle assessment perspective. So comparing it to that, what would you do if alternative business as usual scenario, the time it takes to start accruing carbon benefits. So it might be 10 years for using only residual material from mills. It might look pretty gnarly if it's just harvested round wood under different kinds of silviculture or different kinds of forest management that wouldn't have been cut if it weren't for this bioenergy system. And again, a different picture if it was redirecting this harvest from pulpwood to combined heat and power. And we also looked at, based on the numbers that we had from Stats Canada and the province, what the likely mix was in the year the study was done of both secondary and primary material. And you can see these different numbers there. But I've already probably gone too much into the weeds. But anyways, like I said, happy to have follow-ups or share that paper. But all of that suffice to say in terms of what are the trends. It's all well good to have a snapshot, but where are we coming from and where are we going when it comes to the forests and forest sector of Nova Scotia and climate change? Well, we know that I think it's defensible to say that between the national inventory and our data, both show that Nova Scotia's forests and forest products are a net carbon sink. That's a good thing, but that sink is in flux, and it depends on data, scale, and assumptions that we use. Federal estimates think that the sink is shrinking. We've done some more recent modeling that they don't have yet, which includes the implementation of the Leahy recommendations and the closure of Northern Pulp, which does drastically change things in this province, and that bolsters our carbon sinks. And I think probably everyone from all walks of life would agree that our forests and forest sector do have a role to play and can have a good one, and need to contribute to our work against climate change. And all the research that we're doing and modeling that we're doing and planning that we're still always working on support the findings that the Triad is a decent way to go about mitigating trade-offs across these zones of the Triad and increasing the benefits of the carbon benefits of the forest. Now we've got a nice little transition slide. I'm looking at my clock. I don't know, Jenica, do people usually stop for questions, or should I just go through the end? I'm easy either way. I can't see if there's hands up or if there's chats or anything like that.
Either way, I'm not seeing any hands or anything in the chat just yet, so no one's jumping at the bit. But yeah, if anyone has a question now,
maybe I'll keep going. Sure.
I unmute, but can you hear me? Are you able to hear me?
So, ecological forestry and the Triad. So, what are the different dimensions, possibilities, dynamics of forest carbon across these different zones of the Triad? And so I've been giving this a lot of thought, as I'm sure a lot of people have. I've been spending a lot of time doing research on this and modeling. And there's, I think, a couple of key things here is that when it comes to carbon accounting, there's so much complexity there and so many assumptions required that it's the transparency is challenging, right? So you've got to do the best job you can as a researcher to make that clear. And, you can, depending on these assumptions, things can look very different. But, there's a lot of older arguments around forest and carbon that predate my start with the department, and I just try and skirt because I don't think they're relevant. What's better, storage or sequestration, or what do we do for forest carbon? The critical piece here, and if we draw from the national inventory of greenhouse gases and look at the numbers of every little molecule of carbon that we can account for across the forest, dead or alive, you can't separate one from the other. You need to sequester or remove as much carbon from the atmosphere, and you need to keep it out of there for as long as possible. So it's an all-in kind of game. And so when we think about that perspective and across the different zones of the Triads, I think that can help paint a picture of where there are these sort of trade-offs, but also synergies here in forest carbon. So first off, when we talk about the conservation zone, well, and what that can do for carbon, it can do a lot, huge amounts. And a lot of that is going to be dependent on your current conditions when you move into a protected area or conservation status, the history of management or disturbance, and also, what's your ecology and disturbance regimes of this particular forest. So if we look at Keji, down where a lot of you are, near the community forest, well, when this was protected back in the 70s, I'm pretty sure that's right, hopefully, it was a younger forest. We're looking at 30 some odd tons of carbon per hectare in the living forest biomass stocks. That's a younger forest, and it has sequestered and stored a lot of carbon in those 40 some odd. How many years is that? I'm getting old too. I won't tell you how old I just turned. But anyways, it has removed a lot of carbon and continues to store it, which is great. Pending, putting aside the hemlock woolly adelgid for now. Whereas if we look at the Cape Breton Highlands National Park, where the forests are affected by spruce budworm cyclical disturbances, it's a different here. So these are all based on permanent sample plots, our inventory permanent sample plots tracked back since the 60s. And to me, this tells two important takeaways. I think is that in the conservation zone, your number one priority is biodiversity. So you're not managing for other values or other uses for this carbon. So the most that forest can do for fighting climate change, it's going to do. It's going to continue to sequester carbon. And I think that the second takeaway for me is the question becomes, what do we do about natural disturbances, especially within a changing climate where they're becoming less natural? Now, spruce budworm is a native disturbance in the province, but there are others that are not. So when we talk about climate change mitigation in the conservation zone, like those are the things that step into my mind, and also that you've kind of done what you can do for carbon when you move it into that zone. Of course, where things get a little more nuanced and rely on more assumptions and modeling of how we track our forest carbon is the two zones of the managed forests. So I'm going to delve into that just a little bit from the perspective of two zones. So that's the high production zone and the ecological matrix, and two different scales, spatial scales or levels of assessment, which is the scale of the individual stand and the scale of the landscape. And there's some, I think, important distinctions there. So we've been working away at linking in not only just taking this new model of forest, which requires forest planning, strategic forest planning and modeling, which is ecological forestry and the Triad. But then once we're starting to work this into our model so we can understand how the forest might change and respond to this pivot, but also catching up on the carbon front with this too. So some of you might have seen the first iteration of this was a high production forestry reports that included some carbon modeling results as well. That's ongoing for the ecological matrix. It's a bit more of a challenging one, and I wish I could spend all night showing you the modeling realities of that, but it's an ongoing process anyways. But that'll be forthcoming too, and you'll be seeing some findings there too. But we're starting to get a picture of our carbon dynamics of these two different zones, and we can see the two different scenarios of high production that were investigated with different rotation lengths and commercial thinning timings or not of 3 different spruce species, and some assumptions around using improved growing stock, which I mentioned earlier, and tracking our 3 different pools. And you'll notice that soil is absent from these pools, our 4th category. And we'll get to that in a second. So what we can say about the high production zone is, on average, there's typically less carbon on the land base, sort of at the landscape level. And while these stands do accrue quite a bit more carbon than a lot of natural stands, not all natural stands, but sort of younger ones, obviously of comparable age, there's much shorter rotation. So averaged out is a bit less carbon on the land base. There are higher yields of longer lived products and carbon increases in carbon storage there, where the focus of this zone is sawable products, is lumber and the like, which does have a longer half-life, which is what we use to model its carbon storage. Whereas in the ecological matrix, there's typically more carbon on the land base, especially in dead organic matter, which has important connotations for biodiversity. And a key thing here is that, I feel like often we have a habit of lumping baskets of forest values together, where carbon gets lumped in with biodiversity or carbon gets lumped in with production or whatever else. But, I can tell you right now that doing the best thing for forest carbon and only forest carbon, depending on the forest and the scale and the zone and the scenario of management that you're looking at, might be good or bad for biodiversity. It might be good or bad for sort of forest economics, and it really does depend. So there's no one size fits all thing, which also comes back to the assumptions in your accounting framework, which is always a challenging piece. But what we do know is that the increased amounts of dead organic matter in the land base is good for carbon, but in this instance, it's also good for biodiversity as well. We know that with our snags and, of course, fine wooded material. And there also tends to be obviously more structural and species diversity. Again, that can be good for carbon, but is important for biodiversity, but also for resilience to climate change over the long term. And it sure as heck is harder to model. So forest modeling, I don't know if anyone's dabbled themselves over the years, but a lot of the history, across Canada and really around sort of a lot of the temperate managed forest and boreal forest of the world have been around even age management. And, we're all here in this room because we know that we're shifting away from that. But I'll tell you, it sure is a lot easier to model as well. So we have to build on these modeling tools that we have that were kind of developed in a time of that lens, even though it's no longer here, and think in a more uneven aged management kind of way in our forest modeling. So with a tool like CBM, which has that same lineage, it requires a lot of splitting and growing of cohorts and reinitiating dead organic matter, blah, 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 blah. It's tough, but we're investing other tools right now that will help both on the forest modeling side and the carbon side with shifting a lot of our modeling to individual trees as opposed to stands to help address with this. And one of our staffers, who some of you may have met, Jamie Ring, is part of our national NSERC, or a science research network across Canada, that's investing in that now. It's the subject of his master's, which a lot of us are looking at eagerly. But when we track this at the stand level, and we're starting to look at, so what's the carbon picture here at the stand level? And when I say stand level, I mean, something per hectare, starting with nothing at zero, So the starting conditions here is a stand initiation kind of disturbance event, a harvest in the case of our models, the way that we're set up. And it's tracking the cumulative emissions of carbon to the atmosphere and the cumulative removal of carbon from the atmosphere from that zero condition of something per hectare. So, at the stand level. So we can look at that from the perspective of net primary productivity. And, so that's just the amount of carbon removed from the atmosphere from only the living forest biomass. So it doesn't count the carbon that's emitted when dead stuff decomposes, which happens, and when products decompose or are combusted, which happens. So the former gives us net ecosystem productivity, and when we include those anthropogenic sources, the products, then we give our net biome productivity. And when we track all of them together, which really we should be doing from the point of view of carbon accounting, you can see that obviously there's less of a carbon sink when you start to include all these other sources of emissions. And over a comparable length of time, a sort of ecological matrixy kind of treatment, which is kind of the poster child of our new silvicultural regime in the matrix, the irregular shelter woods, compared to a few rotations in a similar time frame of high production. They're comparable. The high production does lead to cumulative emissions that are a bit higher than the matrix. Here, soils aren't included, as I mentioned, which is declining soil carbon in intensively managed forests is a concern, and it's published in the literature. We didn't include it to be conservative, actually, because CBM wasn't really designed to handle these kinds of intensive forest plantation kinds of management, and so it was over predicting the soil carbon and showing these increases, which we thought wasn't defensible without further empirical field research, which is why it was removed. but we know that is going to something that's going to change the balance. But what really changes the balance here is scale, right? And assumptions and your entire working forest. And that's the key piece here. So we build up across scales in our modeling from that starting point, the tree or at the stand level or at the stick of deadwood level. And we start to think about these landscape level considerations. So I don't look at the ecological aspects of landscape like connectivity and those kinds of things. When I look at carbon, just looking at carbon numbers. So some of those key considerations are, you know, when do you start counting your carbon? So let's take high production forestry, for example. So I showed you those results at the stand level, but you know, what are your starting conditions when you implement, you know, let's say ecological forestry in the Triad? If you're starting with your starting conditions are a recent cut, a recent disturbance, or abandoned aquaculture, or whatever, well, you start to accrue carbon and net carbon benefits or removals, you know, almost right away. But if your starting conditions involved a harvest and then the establishment of high production forestry, well, then you amass a bit of a carbon debt that needs to be repaid based on these different starting conditions when you scale this up to the landscape level. So this does play out to, you know, looking at some longer term carbon benefits regardless, but the time it takes to achieve those does depend on these landscape considerations of spatial scale, but also, like I said, of assumptions when you start counting your beans, as it were. With the matrix, a critical piece there is what's your management and your disturbance history here, and what's your assumption around forest harvesting. So we see here in this a real landscape from Nova Scotia, but a test one for research purposes in eastern parts of the province that does include some maritime boreal forest, that the matrix is a whopper when it comes to carbon. It's the largest zone of the matrix, and there's a starting conditions of a younger forest in this particular forest, and we see a large accumulation of carbon storage, and as such in this lower one, I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, hopefully you can. This light blue one on the bottom, which is our net carbon removals or our carbon sinkiness that you can see here in the matrix, kind of takes the cake. The conservation zone, this particular area, we won't look at it for the sakes of this initiative here, but it does contain a lot of balsam fir where you see a little bit of decline in carbon stocks there. The high production zone, you know, kind of slow and steady wins the race. It's a smaller net sink there, like I mentioned, a bit less carbon in the land base, but a key consideration there is there an assumption in the managed forest that the harvest levels or the wood supply will remain the same? Because these carbon benefits in matrix are achieved by reducing harvest levels in the short term, which in turn are supported by increased levels of harvest in high production. So it's where I talk about that the trade-off versus synergies of our different kinds of values around forests across the Triad. And I don't know, maybe I'm a subscriber, but I tend to think, well, it does provide trade-offs and synergies with some core forest values that made the front lines of the independent review as forest practices like biodiversity. I think it does a similar job with carbon as well, which I think is a good thing at the end of the day. But as always, and you'll never hear me say otherwise, or if you do, I don't know, put me out to pasture or turn off the webinar, is future research is always needed, you know, here. And so this is both, you know, basic research on forest carbon and these different types of forest management, you know, the life cycle assessment of different substitution or not substitution of products, soil carbon. These are basic things we need to learn. We also need to know applied realities for applying things that we already do know in the Nova Scotia context, because it's a different forest than a lot of parts of this country. And oh geez, I'm getting long-winded here, 7:40. Okay, I definitely want to save time for questions. But what we also need as well when we talk to future research is more than just modeling, of course. And you know, as someone who spent a lot of my career being a modeler, even though I'm a lot focused now on field research and silviculture, you can't just have models. You got to conduct field research and monitor as well. Takes a lot longer when it comes to forests, but it's a necessary complement. And without question is any lofty ideals we have with climate change mitigation and what role forests in Nova Scotia can play are threatened by the impacts of climate change. And if we stopped emitting today, there will still be impacts of climate change. That's kind of, that check is written. And we only have to look at, well, here, yeah, my last sort of bummer slide, which is the kind of trifecta of disturbances, which is, a generational storm, Fiona, post-tropical storm Fiona, followed by the biggest fire in recorded history in Nova Scotia, in Shelburne County there, the Barrington Lake Fire. And looking down the barrel of potential spruce budworm outbreak as well, which is surrounding our borders in Quebec and Newfoundland. New Brunswick is doing a bit better. New invasive forest pests that can eke out better survival in warmer climates, especially warmer winters, like the hemlock woolly adelgid. I was just in one of our research trials that was started in 2008, just outside of Liverpool, and it was selection management in tolerant softwood, spruce, hemlock, and white pine. And it's looking pretty nice 15 years later, but the regen was all just carpeted in hemlock woolly adelgid, which is a bummer. And of course, like I mentioned, spruce budworm. So we've done a preliminary analysis of the carbon vulnerabilities and what's stored in our hemlock and what would be released with a full untreated, unfettered outbreak across the whole province. We have yet to do that with budworm, but it's on the radar. And that's where I was going to kind of end here on that bummer note, but maybe hopefully on a little bit of a brighter thing before opening up to questions. And sorry, I meant to be 10 minutes shorter, is hopefully useful for some, or whether on the webinar, I see a lot of people who are fairly well versed on the list here, but maybe colleagues, neighbors, or whatever else of woodland owners. As we partnered with the woodland outreach folks, Simon Mutabazi and his gang there, and MTRI and Dalhousie, and we were able to fund a grad student, and we all worked together to develop a new learning module, a home study module for managing woodlands in a changing climate. So, some of it will be pretty introductory, which is needed too, but I think there's some useful tidbits for everyone there. So I won't go through all the details there, but other than myself, there's our co-authors and our partner organizations. And I think that that outreach group is having problems with their website. I didn't see it up there yet, but again, just shoot me an email and I'll send it right over to you if you have interest. So with that, I'll skip these slides and I'll pretend I didn't include, which is just kind of a quick overview of that module for the sake of time. And boom, 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 there. Great. So I'm just going to go out of full screen mode. What's the best way to do this? I'll put my email in the chat so I can see the actual people in chat and all that kind of stuff here. There we go.
That's great. Thanks so much, James. There's a few questions that are coming in the chat, and I'm not sure if you can hear us.
Oh, Jenica, you've asked something about my volume. Did you hopefully hear my talk?
We can hear you. I'm just not sure that you can hear us.
Oh, can you? You know what I've just realized? My button to resume slideshow is the same as my mute button, and unless I hit function, sorry, not my mute, my speaker's off. So did you hear me talk for 40 minutes?
We could hear you. Yeah, we got all the slides and audio, okay, and it was just you couldn't hear us, but we listened along, and there's a number of questions there in the chat. I'm glad. Geez,
I hope I wasn't like talking over everyone there. Yeah, okay, so I guess I muted my speakers, but yeah, I would love to take any questions. I can stay a little, I did go along for a while there, so I can stay a little bit later too. Hopefully my kids are asleep when I get home.
Yeah, there's some questions here in the chat.
Should I just start at the top?
Best? Do you want me to, do you want to start at the top there? And then work your way down. There's just a couple.
So I see Donna Crossland first here.
Mm-hmm.
Would we not guess that while Nova Scotia forests are net carbon sinks, the caveat is that this is only where there are actual mature and functioning forests remaining. In other words, no clear cuts or shrubby recovering landscapes growing up after large-scale heavy harvests. Based on satellite data, which reveals that much of the forest has been removed on a large scale in the past 20 years, can we not presume that much of the landscape is carbon emitting owing to the release of soil carbon? or are they extremely limited in their role of carbon sequestration? And then there's a follow-up here. If soil carbon, I don't know if it's the same question. If soil carbon stores are not modeled, that's only in those high production forestry stand level scenarios. They are modeled elsewhere. High production forestry comes out looking good, but is extremely misleading. Smells like a rose, but is it? So I think two different questions. I'll start with the first one. So when it comes to those current conditions, and if you look at the, and you can see this in the Registry of Buyers report, as well as the National Inventory, which is not available at the provincial scale, but I think that's changing. But you can see some of this in the State of the Forest report, and will in the next one, or you can come talk to me. Our forests that were probably most intensely managed a few decades ago, harvest levels are down and growing stocks are increasing. So we see that, you know, depending on the stand, we look at these carbon yields. It's, you know, several decades that a stand will be a carbon source after something like a clear cut or stand replacing disturbance from those decompositions. But what we have here, when I say that the forest is a net sink or not, that kind of, you know, that is what it is. So that's every single part of the forest, working or non-forest, in any zone of the triad, or, you know, this is pre-triad stuff too that we're looking at. So that accounts for all of it. And so those projections from the federal government that our sink was shrinking to some degree assumes no triad and assumes a fixed harvest rate that doesn't exist anymore. So that's why I mentioned the discrepancies in our models. And then when it comes to the high production forest question, Donna, you know, my knee-jerk reaction when we first started producing these soil carbon results was like, oh man, people are going to say I'm full of S when they see the results that we were producing, right? So CBM is parameterized from plot data. You know, it draws from equations from a number of different studies, allometric equations to get our carbon, decomposition rates, turnover and litter fall rates. And these are from across the country or from individual studies, speculative from wherever. But, you know, there's a big sort of emphasis there on natural stands, on boreal forests, on even age management. And so the amount of growth that was accumulating in the living trees in these high production scenarios, which is real, that's based on measured data from our silviculture trials, was telling the carbon budget model that, boy, if you're getting this kind of growth in a Canadian forest, right, you're going to get so much dead organic matter, and that's going to put so much inputs into the soil, which is why we challenge that assumption, right? So we're doing some measurements now in our silviculture trials of dead organic matter to try and ground those a bit better. But when it comes to the soils, because there's such a big pool, that's why we wouldn't want to over-report numbers of soil carbon that we didn't think were realistic. So if you check the report, what we say is that we have concerns around soil carbon storage and potential declines with intensive management. I'm coming at it from the carbon point of view, but my colleague since moved on to the Family Forest Network, Kevin Keys, our soils expert, his concerns are from the soil nutrient level. There's some synergies there, but it's, you know, high production forestry will require nutrient management, which does help to ameliorate some of those potential declines in soil carbon. But, you know, some discussions that we looked at were around, you know, biochar or wood ash too, to help ameliorate soil carbon situations too. But one thing that everyone agrees on is monitoring and research. Yeah, so I'll just keep going down the list here. I was just kind of thinking about what I just said and forgot what I was doing. David Patriquin, how are nutrient issues hey, look at that. What are the odds? How are nutrient issues Kevin Keys, etc. Work taken into account by the future carbon storage? David, if you want to elaborate a bit, I'm not too sure what you mean there, but probably the answer is they're not, other than just what I said, but will be in our provincial model, where you might be familiar with sort of the provincial strategic level model that kind of brings everything together, both policy constraints, assumed harvest levels under different scenarios, protected areas, the old forest policy. As we increasingly bring in all these new things that came with Leahy and before that into that model, the constraints of sustainable harvest levels from the nutrient budget model. So what what they will call the SUSMI, so the Sustainable Mean Annual Increment. Those constraints are in that model, and that will be reflected in the carbon stocks and carbon dynamics. But the carbon is a result of that. There's no, you know what I mean, like informed synergy there. It's just a result of the modeling.
Sorry, can I just let me ask you a question? What do you think the impact of that will be on the predictions? I mean, given that 60% of the landscape is severely, the base depleted, and it hasn't, a lot of what we're harvesting now is nutrients accumulated 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. We haven't really begun to sort of deal with that. So I'm just wondering, that's a major concern I have about this whole area, that we just don't pay much attention to that. And then there's the whole linkage to the aquatic systems with the carbon emissions, the stuff Shannon Sterling has done and so on and so forth. There's some very big movements of carbon in those systems.
The aquatic,
how do you feel about
it? The aquatic carbon is kind of the forgotten one there, yeah. And
yeah,
I'm involved with a study on a PhD committee with a student out of Dalhousie who's looking at dissolved organic carbon with the carbon budget model in Nova Scotia forest, albeit a small representation of it, the Pockwalk watershed, around, how much, if you've ever been to a Scotch distillery, they call it the angel share, but how much of that angel share that would go into dissolved organic carbon within aquatic systems are we not accounting for? It can be substantive, and the fluxes of that matter for the carbon budget. We're not looking at that at all, and no jurisdiction really is right now when it comes to carbon accounting, other than at the research level, right? So being involved in this research, which is part of the national network. When it comes to nutrient budget model, I, try to be responsible civil servants, a scientist here, and don't want to speak to areas that aren't my exact expertise. So when we talk about the nutrient budget model and those kinds of things and what the impacts on the overall forest will be, there's research forthcoming, and Kevin can speak to that, but I know that what went into the nutrient budget model and the resulting constraints on sustainable harvest levels that are required on Crown land is conservative. And I know that, but what I do know is that preliminary estimates and some modeling, but again, we need to really do a rigorous job here, which is why everything moves so slow. There's only so many people, but in the ecological matrix, by and large, the reduction in harvest levels, or that is the increased levels of retention, put any given harvest or silviculture treatment, put a lot of them below what would be required for the nutrient reasons. So the SGEM, or the new required silviculture guide for the ecological matrix, is likely in a lot of cases more constraining, and where it isn't, then you need to change your practices to meet those sustainable levels from the nutrient point of view. So that's being implemented right now, and I have, it's a bit of a black box to me personally, not being a soil scientist. I have faith in what went into that, and where you're not in the ecological matrix and in the high production zone, there's that required nutrient management regime to accommodate some of that.
Great, thanks so much, James. We got 2 more questions here in the chat. I don't mind reading the next one out here.
Sure.
Have we looked at the stored soil carbon in the maritime boreal, where decay rates and decomposing wood after mortality factor highly, versus northern boreal, where more fire comes into play that reduces soil carbon stores?
So everyone loves soil, eh? Geez, I got to start having a soil scientist with me in these presentations. So we look at it, but we look at that from the perspective of the province of Nova Scotia. So the decomposition rates in our modeling is driven by mean annual temperature in Nova Scotia. And increasingly in various offshoot studies and smaller analyses, we're looking at that sensitivity. That's just the way that the CBM was set up. But, for example, in this research we're doing with the PhD student, David Foster, he is looking at mean annual temperatures of his exact study area and then testing the sensitivity of those different temperatures. Now, the reasons that is done is for climate change, not looking at boreal versus maritime boreal here in Nova Scotia. But if it's cold and wet, the carbon lasts longer. If it's hot, it decomposes faster. The amount lost to wildfire, is substantive compared to in the maritime boreal, where it's mainly wind or spruce budworms. So is the dominant disturbance regime. But there's a major loss of the forest floor and the litter and the foliage and fine material in the fire, but it's only between 10 and 20% of the actual carbon of the living forest biomass, for example, that's lost in the emissions of the actual burning, and a lot of that does continue to decompose. So it's not light years away, but it does make a big difference, especially for the forest floor soil carbon. But you said, have we looked at how it comes into play? I haven't done any boreal forest modeling, only Nova Scotia. Well, no, that's not true. I did a study in the Yukon, and it decomposes a lot slower. But that's a different world.
Great. And the final question here that David had was asking if you could comment on the critiques widely expressed about Canada's forest carbon accounting.
I can, yeah. So not in detail because I'm not part of that team, but I am on the National Forest Sinks Committee, which is made up of federal government, provincial and territorial governments, and academics, all that in some way or another involved in carbon modeling. So the number one commitment, not the number one, but at least certainly a big one in the National Inventories Program in all sectors, so forests, but also wherever else, energy, transportation, I don't know, what's another sector, commit to continuous improvement through research and reducing uncertainty and accounting for uncertainty. So there are changes coming to the national inventory with regards to forests that have been in the works for a while, but you'll be familiar with peer review process, and review process takes sometimes years. So that's in the works, in part in response to some criticisms, but also predating it. But I have faith in a lot of those folks doing that work. And when I used to work at Dow, I got funding to help develop their methodology for urban forest, actually. So they're constantly, I was excited, and that study only recently got published, but it'll be replaced probably in a year or two. So you only get a bit of a moment of glory because it's constantly in flux. But having reviewed a lot of those reports that do have criticism, thinking back to my comment on the assumptions required and complexities and often lack of transparency of carbon accounting, I see some advocacy and some agendas in those reports as well, and I think it's fairly unanimously agreed upon, at least with a lot of colleagues that are in the world of carbon accounting. We know that there are some flaws, but we also know that people have agendas too, and so I think that some things, and at least the reports that I reviewed, were overstated or oversimplified and didn't show a lack of rigor in proving their arguments empirically.
Great. Thanks so much, James. We did get Nina snuck in another question, if you don't mind sticking around.
Sure.
She wrote, could you give a couple of examples of carbon storage, including soil storage, in older mixed forests, say over 80 years, versus young forest?
Sure. Well, that's kind of the easier one here. So, I mean, let's let me just bringing up something here. Sorry, the internet connection, I guess, is not as good here. So we wanted to look at, so in the coarser sort of CBM modeling that we use, it's driven by leading species of a stand only. So there's no such thing as mixed wood in this modeling. It's either a hardwood leading or softwood leading forest. As we're moving towards individual tree-based modeling and carbon modeling associated with that nuance will be better there. And we can use those mixes of species across our inventory data, no problem, our PSP data, for example, but with our long-term strategic carbon level models, we can just compare hardwood and softwood. So this, for example, is a red spruce stand, and we can see here the different compartments of the living biomass carbon over time. So I didn't have them all together in this graphic. I probably should, but we starting at 0, getting up to around, and this is a sort of tolerant red spruce forest, to around probably 60-80 tons per hectare when you add these all up. We see the dead organic matter, which is that flux of carbon storage and dead organic matter after a stand replacing disturbance that then decomposes, which is why, speaking to that question earlier of why a recent stand, again at the stand level, is a net source of carbon, and then our soil carbon here over time, which is packs of wallop. So you'll see what I meant here around soil carbon and how these assumptions you need to make if you want to model the carbon of a whole province, they need to happen. But that's why we keep on drilling and doing more research. But if we look at switching this to tolerant hardwood forest, so if we go to here, we've got in our mineral soil, was that 60 tons per hectare? Take that to over 100, right? So drastically different soil carbon conditions there.
And that tool you were just showing, is that publicly available for people to play around in?
No, it's in the works.
It looks fun.
We'll get there.
Well, that's all the questions I'm seeing in the chat. If there's any last minute questions, if anyone wants to unmute and ask, we're at 8 o'clock here, but I'll give you a couple moments. We had a great discussion, and thanks so much, James, for being in the hot seat, perhaps literally.
I'm used to it.
It's great. It was a great presentation, and I'm glad we had some good discussion as well. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll have the recording up on our YouTube page if you wanted to go back and pause or look back. And James shared his email in the chat, james.steenberg@novascotia.ca. If you had any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out. But thank you all so much for joining. And James, I hope you go home to sleeping babies and air conditioning.
Definitely. Thanks for that.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Take care.
Have a great night.